This year, the theme for Words at Wagstaffe is sliding doors. Our authors are unafraid to twist history to their liking and ask the question, what if? What if the moon landing had failed? What if we knew what happened to Miles Franklin when she disappeared at 21? What if a gangster mob ruled 1938 Soviet Union? And what if an extraordinary woman called Betty lived to 100? We now have our first conversation for the day, Going Undercover with Miles Franklin, with author Kerrie Davies in conversation with moderator Sue Williams. Let me just tell you a couple of lines about these two ladies. Sue Williams is a best-selling author, an award-winning journalist and travel writer who has written 3 historical novels set in colonial Australia. Her most recent non-fiction book, Run for Your Life, is the remarkable true story of a family forced into hiding after leaking Russian secrets. So Kerrie Davies is the author of A Wife's Heart that created national discussion about the iconic poet Henry Lawson and his marriage. She has appeared at the Sydney and Brisbane Writers' Festivals and the National Folk Festival, Canberra. A former journalist for Vogue and the Sunday Telegraph, Kerrie is a senior lecturer at the School of the Arts and Media, University of New South Wales, Sydney, a 2024 visiting fellow at the State Library of New South Wales, and writes for The Conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming today, and it's really my privilege to talk to Kerrie because I loved her book. I don't know if anybody's read it yet, the Miles Franklin book. I learned so much about Miles Franklin, quite incredible. And I just wanted to ask you, Kerrie, when did you first come across Miles Franklin?
Well, thank you so much for being here, and also, Sue, I loved your book as well. I just finished it
Mutual
last
Admiration
night.
Society.
So The Governor,
yeah.
Wife and the Mistress. She's always been in the cultural minds, you know, and I always thought of her as the award, you know, the Miles Franklin Award. So I've loved literature all my life, so I was aware of that. My Brilliant Career, I was aware of. I think I'd read it years ago, the film. I was a little young when it came out, but I was aware of that as iconic as well. Yeah. And then I just went from there thinking about, a bit like the Henry Lawson book as well, like the same thing, cultural knowledge, but then I kind of fall down these kind of like social side doors, you know, where I kind of get these stumble upon one line. So for the Henry Lawson, Bertha Lawson, it was just being told casually that she put him in jail for not paying his child support. I was like, sorry, what happened? And I was a single parent at the time, so that instantly sent me down there. And then with Miles, I was researching for another academic about colonial journalism, and went looking for the big names because, as everyone knows, as a writer, very few writers usually need a side hustle, as my students would call it, you know, as a job. And so I was thinking a lot of them probably wrote journalism. So Banjo Patterson wrote wonderful war stories. He's such an exquisite writer with war and sport. But then I was like, well, where are the women? Okay. Oh, Miles Franklin. She was around at that time, so I kind of happily look at the Australian Dictionary biography, and there's this one line. Oh, she went undercover as a servant, you know, in research of literary material. And I was just like, that's just fascinating. So that's what started me off. And I was instantly fascinated with her becoming a journalist and an undercover servant for a year. And then I found the manuscript. And then my friend Blanche, who's in the audience, helped me transcribe the manuscript that's in the library. So, yeah.
And that was quite incredible, wasn't it, going undercover for a year to become a servant? Because, I mean, if you were a servant now, it would be an awful lot easier with washing machines and Dysons. But she had a really tough time, didn't she?
She did. So she did it to investigate the servant question at the time, but she also needed money, which you don't normally associate with famous writers. So it was a win-win situation for her. The servant question at the time, everyone was worried, like all their servants were going to the factories, can't get a good girl, you know, it's just so hard. And then all the servants were like, if you treated us better, we would, be, maybe we would stay. So she decided, okay, I'm going to go and be a servant, and I'm going to investigate this, and I'm going to write about it. And she kept a diary every night, which shows how difficult it was. So they had, hand cranking mangles, and she was burnt once, and it was all the steam. The gas just freaked her out because that was new, the gas. Days from no working conditions, so from dawn till late at night. Got an afternoon a week off if she was lucky. That was a nice mistress, as they were called, mistresses. So yes.
Yeah. And that was a fantastic look at the culture of the time, wasn't it, between the mistresses and masters and the servants, and there seemed to be incredible tension between them too.
She said that nobody could understand the feud between mistress and maid without doing it yourself, without first-hand experience. So that was her premise. And so she did find it very frustrating. She also found it very frustrating that in her first place, which was in Waverley in Sydney, it was actually like quite a small, well-run house. And so she called it like a cubby house. And it kind of frustrated her that this was this really obviously intelligent woman that she was working for, that she just was so constricted to all she could do was order her about, So that was incredibly difficult for her to kind of take. And and the guy, she just said he was like boss of his own backyard and lord of his own hallway, So she was very funny.
And she kind of, at the beginning, I think because she was such a cultured woman, she didn't so much despise the other servants, but she wasn't particularly friendly with them. But by the end, she started to identify as a servant and became friends with many of them, didn't she?
Yeah, I think in a way, My Brilliant Career really put her into that celebrity orbit of Sydney. And so she had people like Rose Scott, who was, the suffragette, calling her spirit child. She was feted at Government House. And she came from a cultured family, even though the drought had made them impoverished. But her grandmother, that always reminded me of Violet in Downton Abbey, the matriarch on the snowy mountains, had servants. So it was cultured poor. So she still had that kind of status and that class. And I was thinking about that in your book as well, how that kind of fell out the window in the early days of the colonies. But by the time that it was back, definitely, that class strictures and, so it was like, ooh, I'm going to go meet some tradies. Oh. And, and she was a bit and the parents were horrified. They were terrified for her, and they said it caused horror among my circle. To be a governess or nurse was all right, but a servant, oh my God. So it was really interesting. So it really did cut the corners off her because she came quite friendly, and of course all the tradies fell in love with her. It was just, it rounded her corners really. It was like her second coming of age really, which I guess is what the book's about. It's like the real life sequel to My Brilliant Career, and it was very much about her maturing into the person that we know today.
Absolutely. And what fascinated me as well was that it seems so contemporary. There are so many contemporary parallels with our lives as well. Like she was a writer, but she had to work to earn money in different jobs, and you've just said, your side job at the university enables you to keep writing as well.
My students,
and then we tend
them.
and not many of us have servants anymore, but we all have access to servants through the service industry, through the gig economy. And I think you've drawn that parallel as well before.
Yeah, so I just wrote a piece for The Conversation, which I was talking about the servants as contemporary servants. Instead of ringing a bell, we press an app. We have on-demand chauffeurs, we have Ubers, we have delivery drivers that bring freshly made food to our door. So I felt we have on-demand cleaners, so they're through the gig economy. So I was thinking how interesting it was that we still have servants, but we don't call them servants. But that casual exploitation that still happens, and the government's been trying to do stuff about that as well, like with Fair Work. So the piece in The Conversation was talking about Miles and very much putting her, in that time as what she did. and also the undercover journalism of women around that time, because they were taking huge risks to get into the newspapers. Miles actually wanted to write a book. She was in for the long haul. But a lot of women like her at that time were doing these undercover investigations to basically break down the door, let alone the glass ceiling. They hadn't even got into the room beyond the woman's pages. So it's so interesting to put her in that and then see, well, we don't have servants anymore. And yes, it would be so much easier. You just press a few buttons, and there's even robot vacuums. So I'm pretty sure my dog would eat it. I have a huge Shepsky, a massive German Shepherd Husky, and I have visions of him running after a robot vacuum. So yes, but having said that, it still exists on that on-demand economy and that precariousness that she felt all the time, and that, you're there now. Yes.
And what impressed you so much that you decided to write a book about her? Because she did My Brilliant Career, then she did this 1 year as a servant, because she wrote a novel about that as well, but it never got published. She could never get it published. Yeah. And you found the manuscript. But what made you really want to write a book about her?
I loved her voice. I thought that what she did was so fascinating, was such an important bit of social history, and I thought it showed a different side of Miles to what we knew so much. I mean, she's had biographies written about her before. I mean, the biggest one is Jill Rose, Cradle to Grave. So initially I was very only interested in the servant manuscript, because I felt a bit like with the Bertha Lawson and the putting him in jail, that had been brushed over with biographers. It's like, well, that happened and moving on. Or Bertha was mad, she was horrible, she ruined him. But with Miles, it was like, oh, well, she worked as a servant for a year, it didn't work out, moving on. I was like, sorry, I want to stay there. So I was staying in that period, and I really have come to realise, as you would know, Sue, when you come to write, you go, oh, this is what I do, okay. And it's part biography, so I really like just pausing and you living the life with them in that period. You're just living the life in their Edwardian world at that time, with all the challenges, with the rise of first wave. The votes had just come in Australia and America, they were still fighting for it. UK as well, was really hunger strikes and jailings and guerrilla warfare almost. So it was such an amazing time as well, and I just kind of fell in love with that time, but also how she was such, in that time, she was fighting for her own choices, really fighting for her own choices. She refused the status quo, and I really admired that about her. So when I was talking with my publisher, and he was like, well, how do, because initially I just wanted to do the servant work, and the manuscript itself is quite dense. She changes point of view halfway through. She goes from first and then becomes Marianne. That's what she called herself, Marianne the servant. And so it was very difficult to publish as a work by itself. And I was like, well, why don't we do this in a more kind of creative non-fiction way, narrative, like what Sue does, but I guess more non-fiction. And I just decided to go with that and go from 1901 with the success of My Brilliant Career. She's the toast of Sydney, everyone loves her, and then suddenly within a couple of years she's a servant. And then my publisher was, what happened after that? What happened next? And I was like, okay. So then I ended up going further than I thought, right to 1915, and then I stopped with the war, with the second year of the war, and that's when, that's where the book ends, and that charts this really mature coming of age of Miles, the real life sequel, really, and that allows you just to build her world and live that life with her for just those 15 years.
So then you can write another book about the next 15 years.
Oh, yeah. Well,
and then another.
Well, actually, there's a great Salonika Burning by Gail Jones.
Oh, right. Oh,
yeah,
yes, yeah.
I love Gail Jones. And she's written a fictional book about Miles and working volunteer as a volunteer orderly in the World War One. And she's there with Stanley Spencer, who was actually my daughter's grandfather's best friend. So that's when I was the Stanley Spencer, the artist, the English artist, and also Olive Cotton. and someone else who I've forgotten. So she said I didn't know that they were all there together, so she constructed a fictional story around it. And obviously Jill Rowe has written the full story, like it literally weighs a kilo, the original biography. She even researched what pencil she used, apparently. So it's very dense and big, but it's the definitive guide.
Absolutely. Because that's one of the things I loved about your book. You really created the world in which she lived. And all those people who were her contemporaries, Banjo Paterson, Henry Lawson, Norman Lindsay, and some of them were really good to her and some of them were not quite so good.
Yeah, so definitely A.B. Paterson, he was a surprise turn-up in the story. So they had a bit of a romance. He was a bit of a man about town at the time. Norman Lindsay was totally in love with her, but of course was married, but he was in love with anyone, I think. And they said later, the love affair that we never had. So they were very flirty. So yeah, there was definitely the men after her where, she was constantly surrounded. She had boundaries. She was strong. She was very moral, but she was very flirty. So she definitely enjoyed the attention and was very flirtatious and charming and a little pocket rocket. She was very tiny and petite, and Norman Lindsay just was she's just like the most beautiful little thing. And everyone was comparing her to the French Parisian teenager that wrote a memoir that inspired Anne Nin. And her name was Marie Bashkirtseff, and there's a picture of her in the book, and she was the one that said, I am my own heroine. And so he was like, she's our Marie, she's the Australian Marie. So those people around her. Rose Scott was incredibly, almost to the point of too much, so called her a spirit child. But I think Miles did find her quite suffocating. Miles was quite independent. She could have gone and lived with Rose and just hung out with Rose in Wallara and gone to the salon every Friday. But I think because of she wanted to write another book, she wanted to be independent. She didn't want to have any constraints on her time, and I think a lot of writers feel like that. It's not the best for relationships, writing.
And she was really determined not to marry, wasn't she? I mean, she had plenty of offers, she had lots of opportunities, but she was really determined to be independent, which is quite amazing, really.
And to actually have that conviction at that time is extraordinary, because there was such pressure. Like her grandmother, the Violet Downton Abbey character, she was like, have you found anyone that you like better than yourself? Like, aren't you getting married? And what about him? And what about him? And she's like, and then of course everyone wanted to be Harry Beecham. Like, everyone was imagining that was the hero of my brilliant career that Sam Neill played. And it was like, and they're all stretching up to be 6'3" in their socks, because that was Harry Beecham. So she very much had a lot of male attention, and she could have married well. She could have also been a mistress later in life, definitely. That's later in the story. But she just kept going. I think she saw her mother as well, and having a baby in the bush every year. Like, I was reading your book, and it was like, one of the characters had 13 kids. I was like, oh my God, that's a daycare centre. Yeah. That's a daycare centre, like 13 children.
Exactly. And this morning I had an email from someone who said they'd just finished the book, This Governor, His Wife and His Mistress, and she loved the book, but then she was delighted to discover her great-great-grandmother was in the book as well. And she was the woman who had the 13 children.
Oh my God. So there you go.
It's a very small world.
I know. That's incredible.
Yeah.
So that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she'd seen that, and there's I don't want to have a baby in the bush every year. I don't. But then she could have. I don't particularly. I mean, that's a choice that she respected other women to have, but in traditional marriage and being a mother, and she was very moral, and but she said no. I think she was married to a writing, and I do think as a writer you do get like that. I think when you're married, and my husband learnt this, having gone through the first relationship to survivor book, can I just say? Shout out to him. Yeah. It's difficult because you live that book. You live in their world, and I was living in their world, in Miles's world. So I was also teaching as well. So, to live in that world and build that world, and you live those characters with them, and you feel such a responsibility to them as well. Particularly when it's it's based on history, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. You do feel that you've got a responsibility. You're not writing about dragons, and though that's not a bad idea.
Probably make a lot more money.
Yeah. Make more money.
That's right.
Romantasy, as it's called, is a huge genre. Yeah.
It
Romance
is.
fantasy, for those of you that haven't heard that before. I thought romance was always in fantasy, but
no,
it's romantasy.
Yeah, no, quite.
Yes. So
And
sorry, Sue.
No. And so you did an awful lot of research for this book as well, didn't you? I mean, tell us a bit about what kind of research you did and how you went about that, because it would have been so difficult to research a whole period as well as somebody's life.
I think the research came from world building, because I decided that I didn't want to write a straight biography. And when I say a straight biography, I mean like a more academic biography that you tell the story in that way. And that has been done exceptionally well anyway. Like, why would I? It's been done. So with my publisher's agreement, and in fact he was very excited when I said that, I wanted to write it in a way called creative nonfiction or narrative nonfiction. So it's written like a novel, like it reads like a novel, but you've researched all the details as much as you can, and then you say where you don't know, you do say that in the notes. So I started with that, and I was like, well, how am I going to do this? So first of all, I was thinking about atmosphere and tone, and I literally started a playlist of songs. I think too much Netflix, because there's always a contemporary soundtrack over history at the moment, but that helped to kind of get the atmosphere. I read all her books, and a lot of her books are based on her life, so that really helped, like the mailman that was too drunk to deliver the mail and was always peeking at the mail. That's from the sequel to My Brilliant Career that she eventually published much later in life. So a lot of that work, and the drought and the farm, that was around that time. Stillwater was just like the cows dying and the ponds drying up. And so a lot of that was from her descriptions from My Brilliant Career, but then I wanted to world build around that, and also from the people around her and who she knew. So I started... Have you ever seen Trove, the digital newspaper archive? If you ever do family history or you're doing historical research, it is such a gift, because in the States you have to pay for the archives. Like for the later international research, I had to subscribe to the newspapers I wanted to do. But Trove is free. There's voluntroves that correct the text so you can read it, but you can also just see the original. So, and even just like the local papers, like the Goulburn Penny Press, as well as the big papers like Sydney Morning Herald, the Argus. So I just went looking for those periods, and I would go looking for keywords like, the weather, and it was like January 1902 and a hurricane wind is coming from the west. So I just started, these scenes get constructed kind of little detail by little detail to build their world. And then there was some really quirky stories, and I forget how I stumbled on this. I think I was just looking for around that time, and I saw tiger, and I was like, oh, tiger? Oh, that's interesting. And there was a tiger running around the southern New South Wales. And they thought that it escaped from the Boer. Someone had brought it back as a pet from the Boer War, and it escaped, and it was like the sheep are getting their hearts ripped out, and some teetotaler, which I love that they emphasised he was not drunk, got attacked on his horse, by a white cat, a giant cat with eyes like lanterns. And this is all in the news. And, and I was so fascinated by that they thought this tiger was running around. So it was almost like magical realism in a way, but it was kind of real. And people in Halley's Comet, they were terrified of comets, and the occasional comet would come past and say, do not fear the comet, and then later Halley's Comet, and there's a line it was in the Chicago Tribune, and they're all looking up at the sky with their opera glasses on, and I just maybe too much, just trying to build those worlds, and then also all the worlds of her friends, so their archives and all their letters as well. Like Jack London, the author, she wrote to him asking for help later on, thinking, and he said he wouldn't because he doesn't help anyone. And he says, "Are you a socialist?" Because he was very much into socialism. And the Marianne, she talked to him about the servant book. So I was like, "Are you a socialist? If not, why not?" So there's his wonder. So, and she kept everything, so all her journals as well. So going back to her archives and that of her friends. But the actual tiny little details all come from newspapers. And where I didn't know, have you Kira Lindsay's The Convict Daughter?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so she's similar, and she's sort of also, she's written a lot about this, and she calls it evidence-based imagination. So where I didn't know, and, like, for example, after her sister, when there's a wedding, and Miles goes to bed alone. And so I wrote that she goes to bed alone while her sister, the bride, goes obviously to bed with her husband for the first time. So I'm juxtaposing those two. And I think that's a good, logical, because Miles was quite moral. I doubt she would have brought home anyone from the wedding. Not only because of the time, but she was very moral. She had strong boundaries. And so I think, it is, evidence-based imagination. Yep, she would have gone home alone. But her sister would have spent the night for the very first time in her life with a man. And, so I juxtaposed, and the sister said later it was the worst week of her life. So clearly she was not a fan of the bedtime activities. So that's I think an example. And then the notes at the end. So if you are interested where everything comes from, there's all the notes are at the end for further reading. So you can go and find the Trove article, or I've said this is where I think that happened and this is why I have think that this happened. So I've tried to be transparent as much as I can.
So with all that research, that sounds an awful lot of research, really.
17,000 words, I think, is the note.
Wow,
so that's just a little part at the end.
Yeah. So did you find it quite hard to order the research? I think the thing about research, it's so pleasant doing it because you're learning new stuff and it's really interesting, and you go down rabbit holes and you end up with so much research and you think, oh God, I'm meant to be writing a book.
I know.
Did you find that sometimes?
Sometimes, and I really had to eyes on the prize. You really had to stay focused on the story. But I had done all the servant research over, and a lot of that was done just before COVID. And then I left alone over COVID, wondering what to do with it. And so I had that quite strong. That was already done. But then I started researching, and I just literally went 1 year at a time. So I just went, okay, this was happening in 1901, and yes, and then did kind of bookmark. My bookmark was like bookmarking, you can do it on Google. I was like, kept bookmarking and going, I hope I don't lose this because it's going to be a nightmare to find again.
Computer
and then
crash.
the libraries as well, and site visits as well. So yeah,
absolutely.
It's hard because you can go off into a complete different direction, and you have to stay really focused on the story arc. And
I've got a friend who's been researching for about 10 years and he still hasn't got any closer to writing the first sentence of his book. And you can sympathise, can't you, really? Because, it becomes an end in itself in lots of ways.
Well, that's the thing with Oppenheimer. That's what happened. The original author of Oppenheimer, he kept researching and researching and researching till I think the research took up a room. And then I think eventually he was partnered with someone, or I can't remember the exact story, but he ended up working with a writer who was very respectful of his research as well. And then he ordered the material, so they actually co-wrote Oppenheimer together. Writers aren't great at working with other people. Script writers are. It's a completely different headspace. And I'm very lucky I work with writers at work, and get to meet people like Sue, so you do have that creative process constantly going to talk about it. But yeah, it does feel sometimes like it's just you and their world. And it's so nice when you finally see the book and you're like, oh, there it is. And I've been talking to Miles. Hey, Miles, we're going to the Central Coast today. It's going to be an amazing day. You're going to really love it. Everyone's going to be there for you. Because I think she would have really enjoyed it. I think I just can't, like, doing that year as a servant and not getting published because of defamation, basically.
But you must feel like you really know her now. You know everything about her, and you must really identify with her in some ways. Your poor husband.
Yeah, he's pretty. Yeah, he's like, when are you writing another book? And I was like, oh, soon. Probably soon. Yeah, no, he's great. And he's a photographer as well, so he understands the creative process. Yeah, I do feel I know her as much as you can know someone through history. I think she was very funny as well. And I hope with the book it shows that for those that only know her as My Brilliant Career, Sibylla. And she was very much like Sibylla, like really fierce and feisty and determined to write. But yeah, she was very vulnerable and anxious, had terrible insomnia. I do feel I know her, but she was also very funny. Like, you know, maybe that's from my grandmother, that wit, like, you know, with we were talking about before, like with Sue's book, you know, there's the wife and the mistress, and I was thinking the line that Miles said to a guy that said, oh, well, I wish a bloke could have two girls, and he said, well, at heart every man's a Mormon. You know, she's just so funny, you know, she's got these great one-liners, but she never gave up. And I think that idea of just the status quo is so strong. Like, you do what society expects you to do. So to take a risk, and that's where I identify, like, she took creative risks, but she also took risks within her own life, like, not, you know, it's a cliche, but the road less travelled. And I think that's a really brave thing to do, and particularly for her and her contemporaries at the time, like all these extraordinary women that became her friends. They were also doing that as well, and I think that's so challenging to do that, especially at that time. I mean, it's hard enough now, and there's a lot of pressure, I think, coming back now, you know, with on women as well. And talking about last night, managing the house and the kids and the career, or even if you're just managing the house and the kids, like, that's full on, you know. And to actually have time for yourself and for what you want to do, and there's freedom to make those choices, I think that's something that really speaks today.
And you talk about her being very creative, but obviously this is a quite creative book. And creative non-fiction, I mean, it's a really interesting area, because it's really hard, because some writers will twist the actual history and change the history and maybe change people's names, or some people really respect the history and just create details around that history, hopefully to embroider and just make it a bit more compelling. I mean, how much of the book is creation, do you think, and how much is history? Is it tension, or do they work really well symbiotically?
I think that's, yeah, like, it's something I really thought a lot about. So I think that probably about 10%, I would say, is like evidence-based imagination, and that's like where I've got speculation. The rest comes from art, constructing scenes. So with creative non-fiction, like, you construct scenes from what you know. So you write in a literary way, a novel way, but you shouldn't be making it up, and if you do, you flag it. You know, so it is that line. And I've thought a lot about, well, when does it become like a truish story? When does it become fiction? And it is when you are, I think, changing history, that you're making up scenes that have, like, you know, it's a different timeline, for example, it's a different character, you know, so it's a bit like creating another timeline, almost like you've broken the timeline in a way, or you create characters that didn't happen, that she didn't know, or you create relationships, or you create tension that wasn't there. And I think that's got its place. And, you know, I think that it's such where it becomes. And I think, you know, Truman Capote in Cold Blood is the class of narrative nonfiction, and which is, you know, that's a really compelling book, but apparently he made up the end, you know, the cemetery scene, and that's you know, and that sort of came out later. And I think now you have to kind of say that if you're going to call it nonfiction, you have to let people know this is where I'm thinking, like I said, evidence-based imagination, So that's where the line is. Otherwise, then it's fiction. I mean, and definitely historical fiction, like you write, is extraordinary. Like, I love it. And there's probably a bit more freedom with that as well. I mean, what do they call Mel Gibson's story? True-ish?
Yes,
that's a new one. True-ish.
Yeah, or based
Apple
on a
cider
lie.
vinegar based on a true story and things like that. So I think that's where, like, with your, you call yours fiction. So
yeah, it's hard, really. And as well, if you're writing Australian historical fiction, there is a difficulty there, because although it's history, there are still descendants around.
yes.
And for the launch of this book, we had the descendant of Philip Gidley King's and his wife, and we also had a descendant of Philip Gidley King and his mistress.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really quite interesting. It was lovely to introduce the two.
Hello.
All these years on, yes. And there was no animosity, obviously, really. But I must say, the descendant of Philip Gidley King and his lawful wife kind of felt that he had much greater control over the Gidley King name than the child of the mistress. So it was there was a bit of class warfare going on there behind the scenes.
That's so interesting. And even with with my book, descendants is still around. And one of her last diaries was recently found by one of her relatives, and she did a little post on Instagram. Oh, there's still interest in Miles. I love that. I can't wait to read the book. And so I was like, oh, that's really cool. And then with my last book, Henry Lawson's, great niece or something, she was like, Bertha was a horrible person. And I was like, okay, so you were still defending the name. Okay. I mean, and people are like, no one's perfect. I mean, I think that's the other thing to bring out. Like, no one's perfect. Miles could be, quite snobby. When she was younger, she had her moments, sometimes she didn't treat people, like she left a few hearts behind, so to speak. She had a lot of her own anxieties. You could argue she was selfish because she just wanted to write, and that was it. And a lot of writers are accused of being selfish. It's not really an excuse, but it's such an interesting thing to kind of look at someone's things. And with Bertha Lawson, the previous book, yes, she was not a perfect person. I mean, and that's something. But then I was looking at the fact that with her, the biographers had basically gone, well, she's mad. She ruined him. And I'm like, oh, she was a single parent in 1903 and she really needed some money, and he'd turn up with a duck or he was drunk. Like, the guy was an icon, but, really? And there was an argument. She put him in jail to dry him out half the time as well. But with Miles, again, who, like I said, fell in through a social side door, she's an icon. And she's the most, she's the biggest award in Australia, the Miles Franklin, so I actually felt a little bit of trepidation. I was a bit like, I was a bit aware, but I wasn't out to, as my daughter says, diss on another icon. She goes, oh, Mum, you're always dissing on icons. And I was just like, what?
Great turn of phrase.
But no, she's hilarious. But no, but I don't think I diss on Miles at all. In fact, I think that I show her as how hard she worked to be remembered. And she never gave up, and I really respect that. She never gave up writing despite everything, and always, was true to herself. So I dedicate the book to those who are kind of true to themselves and, make the choices that they want to make.
Because some of the choices she made were really difficult choices as well, like going over to the US at the time. I mean, many of us might not be particularly keen on going to the US at the moment, but back then, she arrived just 2 weeks after a massive earthquake had almost devastated San Francisco, so it was pretty hard.
And that was one of her best pieces of journalism as well. So yes, sort of, she does go to America, United States. A friend always corrects me, that's not America, it's United States. And she does arrive in the middle of an earthquake, like recovery. So, and she writes for the Sydney Morning Herald the most gripping piece about what the earthquake was like. And it did a strip away class actually. You know, they were just, she saw, you know, men in top hats getting hauled off to like fix logs and look after, you know. So she really had a social eye, and I think that's something that really came out. And journalism suited her because she wrote fast. She said in a fever, and partly I think that was for money. She wasn't big on redrafting, so journalism ended up being probably a lot easier for her than servant work. So she immediately, you know, didn't go, oh no, earthquake, it was scary. She was in amongst it, you know, trying to go among the ruins. So the choice, and that would have been a harder choice at that time. A lot of people said go to England, go to the mother country. That was what most people did. That still happens. You know, you go to the mother country, go to London. So she always took a riskier choice, and she definitely could have stayed at home and been more comfortable. But
absolutely, no. And it'd be lovely to open it up to everybody here. If anybody else would like to ask Kerrie a question about the book, because I think we're running a bit ahead of time, so we'll do that. We've got some microphones as well that can go around people. If anybody has a nice question, or even a horrible question. Yep, shall we go to this gentleman here?
I'm a bit fascinated by this whole business of her becoming a servant. Did she manage to keep that as a secret?
Yes, she did, because we didn't live in Instagram at that stage where everyone was I think at the time her name was known, but it was such a special occasion to get your photo done. But she did get a photo of herself in the servant. There's a picture of her as a servant in the book, and all the other servants like, you can't go out in you know, as a slavey, that's what they're called. Everyone just looks down on you. So I think it was probably the first time the photography studio had a maid getting photographed. And so she managed to keep it a secret right until the end, and then the Bulletin she did a little note for the Bulletin, because the Bulletin magazine had found out what she was doing, and then it just caused complete panic in the houses of Sydney and Melbourne, because all these rich matrons realised that they'd had this possible writer undercover, and they kept remembering who was that well-spoken maid, you know, like, oh, was that her? But she said one of them actually wrote to her and invited her to tea, which speaks well of both of us. So pretty extraordinary that she told everyone she was going overseas, which you could just do and disappear. I think it's hard to disappear now. I was thinking as a celebrity now, that'd be such a hard thing to do.
Absolutely.
So did anybody know?
Yes, the wife of Rose Scott knew, and also the Works minister's wife knew, because she confided in her as for a reference, and then Rose Scott actually found out through, you know, tea with the Minister for Works, a wife, and then O'Sullivan, yes, and then she was like, instantly wrote to Miles going, via the post office, so found out where she was, and goes, I found you, you know, what are you doing? And you've got to stand up for the servant girls, and don't you do those hours, and what are you thinking? And she signed off Rachel's suit, you know, so she gave herself a little which was a little, so very few people knew. Her parents knew, obviously, who were freaking out,
Because I think in the book you mentioned about how sometimes she'd been to parties as Miles herself, and she'd met some people, and then she ended up meeting them again when she was a servant. They didn't even recognise her.
No,
one of them flung his coat at her and said,
their fur coat.
hang that up.
Yeah, she'd have a little giggle because someone would throw their fur coat at her that she'd met at Government House, and you know, or that she'd be serving them tea while they'd be discussing her book, you know. So
that must have been incredible.
She did like that. Yeah, she thought that was quite funny.
It must have been so tempting for her just to interject into the conversation.
Yeah, she did. Like, she'd be stoking the fire and they'd be talking about her book. So it would have been tempting. Just go, hi, you know. And surprise. So very few. I mean, it was interesting because people couldn't quite place it. like she worked at an upmarket boarding house for a while, and there was, people like, you speak so well, you don't sound like... She did actually confide, that's right, in one of the other servant parlour maids, as they were called at the boarding house. And she did confide. She goes, I knew you weren't a common slavey, So it's so the class that completely, like, you fell over at colonial times because everyone was chucked at the ends of the earth. By early 900s, the myth of equality in Australia as an equal, no. That was very much like Little London.
Sure, absolutely. Anybody else? A question?
I've been lucky to work on the book with you and read it as well. And I just, the piece about, landing in San Francisco and then on to Chicago, I found that part about Chicago so interesting. Would love to hear you share a bit more about that.
Okay, so Blanche, she's in the audience, who also drove me here today, because I'm learning to drive late in life. I have to at the moment for certain reasons, and it's like, so thank you. And Blanche also helped me transcribe the manuscript, so she's seen the original handwriting and the original work. So, so Chicago came later. Again, she wasn't planning to ever end up in Chicago. She was planning to go to New York. And Chicago at the time was one of the biggest cities in the world. It still is. And it was like the centre of industry. And that's where she really connected with social justice reformers like Jane Addams, that is very well known in the States as a social justice reformer. And she had a whole house where all the immigrants from the newly arrived immigrants to Chicago would come and, have not just learn English, but they'd look after their kids. They had a daycare centre, so the kids weren't, I think, literally tied to a chair, so they wouldn't go out, while the mum had to go and work. And Chicago at the time, was one of the biggest industries. It had the biggest stock abattoir. And, there's a book by Upton Sinclair that's called The Jungle, that's about immigrants working at the big abattoir there, like massive, the stockyards. And I couldn't eat meat for like a month after it. And he said, I meant to hit people in the heart because it was about the workers, but I hit them in the stomach. And it started the FDA. So a lot of those immigrants were, around Hull House. So I think a lot of her servant work led her into this work. She worked for the Women's Trade Union League, and she just worked, she was involved in all the midst of all the big strikes. And so she was really at the centre of, unrest and just, again, right in the middle of it. And also automobiling and Kodaking. Kodaking was a verb, because the Kodak camera could just come out. I'm going Kodaking. So she also had a great time as well and had some very wealthy friends. But I think the work as a servant kind of gave her a lot of empathy for that social justice work, which she kind of ended up, working with in Chicago. So that was quite an extraordinary place. And it shows, you just follow, I'm just going to go here, and then, that didn't work, I'm going to go here. So she was so adventurous, which for the time, you don't think of women going off on adventures. A lot of them did, though. Not a huge amount, but there was a lot more adventure and going on than women are given credit for at the time. I mean, certainly not now. Like half my students are planning their, backpacking and everything. But it was still, they were pretty amazing for what they did. So parents were constantly like, oh God,
Because it's much more of an adventure in those days, really, because people couldn't phone them and, WhatsApp them every day, and they had no idea where they were, what they were doing.
No, so you'd get letters, and it's a telegram, and the phone, was still quite novel. I mean, reading your book, and, it was 6 months before they get a letter. If they were lucky, if the ship didn't sink on the way. It was just, you forget now because everything's so instant, like how communication at that time was such a precious thing, really.
Absolutely.
It wasn't so, a letter was like, I've got a letter. And she kept everything. She kept all her fan letters from my brilliant career. So she kept all the fan, young women writing to her around the country saying, I want to be you. You've said what I want out, what I feel. letters from Banjo Patterson that he wrote from the Australian Club in the city, you know, the male-only Australian Club. It's on their letterhead, so that's still all their letters from like people like Alice Henry, who was her friend in the States, like there's another Australian journalist that went to the States. So yeah, she was quite extraordinary, like in what she kept, and that really helped build, you know, that build her voice in the world. And I do use her words in the book as much as I can.
Because that's always a difficult thing, isn't it? Finding the voice of somebody you're writing about, especially when they live in such a completely different era. So those letters would have been fantastic for you, I guess, seeing how she wrote.
It was so important because that was the hardest thing of the book, was to kind of build the world but not make sure her voice was still strong in the book, because ultimately it is about her, it's not about me, you know. So to build that, her voice, and that was such a gift, that to have so much of her own writing, but also so many of her letters, her journals, her diaries, you know, were all left as well. So I tried as much as I could to bring in her voice as much as I could. Oh, so a year, which is much longer than your normal gonzo undercover journalist would do. You know, most would only do it for a few weeks at most. In fact, the woman that inspired her, an American English journalist in London, was probably wouldn't have done it. So a year is like, wow.
So during that year that she was the servant, did she choose? Can't hear you.
So do you want the? Yeah.
Sorry. During the year that she was a servant, did she choose to leave some positions, or was she sacked from some, or how did she choose which job to go to?
She decided she'd stay 2 months at pretty much every place. There was one that she found just really tough, and I think my friend that read it said, well, she thought the house was just too dirty, and it was like, my friend who read it went, well, she was employed to clean, you know. So I'm sorry, yeah, she was a bit like, he thought, yeah. So I think occasionally, yeah. So she does acknowledge her privilege. Like, she had Rose Scott up the road, and the O'Sullivans lived, I think, in, you know, the North Shore. So in Mossman, so, you know, she had some very nice places to rest, that she said, between acts. So she was aware of that. She was very conscious of, you know, and once she decided, she could see they wanted to cut down staff, I think, at the boarding house, for example, and she offered to go because one of the girls was crying, saying, I have nowhere to go. If I would have to, you know, where am I going to go? So she was kind of, and she also had a family home. They were out at Penrith at that time because of the farm, the drought killed the farm. So yeah, so it was interesting, yeah. So she pretty much would resign, or they would regretfully send her a letter, you know, write her a reference letter. And so some of those reference letters still exist, and, you know, you can find where she went to most of the houses because of all the letters that were written. And her name that she used was Sarah Franklin, which is Sarah's one of her middle names, and Franklin with a G dangling off the end. But she called the book itself Marianne, because that was the slang for servants at the time. I'm Marianning. Yep.
You mentioned the diaries and the letters that you referenced.
Yes.
Were they bequeathed to an institution, or where did you get those?
Oh, they're all, so Miles Franklin left everything to the State Library of New South Wales.
Okay.
So the majority of her archives are there, and it's huge. A lot of it's been digitised, which is great. Not everything, or it's been digitised, but you have to kind of access it through the library. You know, they have to show you the secret squirrel way to get to the digitisation. Like, I was like, oh, thank God. And they showed me that. And all the handwriting, yeah. So the actual volume itself, the servant manuscripts, is handwritten. She only learnt to type later. So, you know, Blanche and I were going through, and then occasionally, what's that word? Yeah, so the library. The other archive that was big was in New York, the New York Public Library, for some of her friends, even though it was Chicago. The family, the Lloyd family that she became friends with, That's all in the New York Public Library. So that was pretty special, going to the Book Astor room in New York. You had to make an appointment and set it all up before. And so I did those international research. But the majority, very fortunately, because I'm juggling a job while I'm writing this, was in Sydney.
Great,
So.
thanks.
Anybody else over there?
Could you talk a little bit about her celebrity? Because she was, you describe in the book how she was very incredibly famous in Australia, really. Yeah. And yet there was this core, which is sort of relevant today, yet there was a core of herself that she wanted to constantly preserve, and she was very sure of herself from very early. The letter to Henry Lawson, the criticism of not having the question mark in the brackets in the original title of My Brilliant Career, which is a misunderstanding by English people of Australia, I think, actually. And can you talk about, and that sense of needing to preserve herself so much that she would hide? I mean, some of her later novels, I think, were actually published under a nom de plume. So,
yeah, a lot of it was written under a pseudonym. So Miles is actually one of her middle names. She at the time wanted to be known, she said, I do not want to be known as a young girl. And that was her strict instructions to the publishers, which of course they outed her, Henry Lawson outed her in the opening, endorsement. She's just a little girl from the bush. So she was furious about that. And young girls today go, can't believe he did that. That was her choice, And it wasn't about gender fluidity. It was more, I think, about the time and
wanting to be taken seriously.
Wanting to be taken seriously, exactly. So wanting to be taken seriously. So that was super important to her, and she was so upset that and the question mark, like, good detail. Yeah, she was so after that, she would always insist on seeing the proofs. So she was very protective of her own work. The other thing that was important to her, I think, as you said, was her sense of self. And her anxiety, her second book problem. I've written this and now I'm a big success and now I have to write another book. So she'd dash off books. But then all everyone wanted to talk about was My Brilliant Career, and she's like imploring journalists because she did get to have a few interviews when it came out that she'd been working as a servant in Melbourne. This is 1904, and so she's doing the round and everyone just wants to talk about My Brilliant Career, and she goes, I don't want to talk about it anymore. So she did, a sense of herself. She was quite private in that way. She found it very difficult to be written about, but then I think she liked it as well. But, it's something natural, I guess. But, she was very much focused on her sense of self, but she was very anxious. She had terrible insomnia, so she would often write at night. And a lot of that is that insecurity, that imposter syndrome that we know that she felt very keenly because she'd had this huge success. She was called Australia's, she's the Australian Charlotte. She's the Australian Marie Bashkirtseff, even though that was autobiography. And she kept saying, no, it's a novel. Brilliant Career is a novel. Everyone's like, we know, we'll go with that. But then she also was compared to Charlotte Bronte in the English press. So here's this girl, so it was very sudden, and then that's huge expectations to live up to. And so she felt sometimes she did have to hide, and she would go away, and she wrote the book, The Servant manuscript, up in the Blue Mountains, at a friend's house, go away from all concerned. And she didn't like being presented all the time at the salon as, Rose's protege, I think that. Because she felt a lot of pressure, and people was like, oh, well, how's the next book going? And she's like, and we all know that, that feeling if you're working on a project. How's it going? Like, oh, that's been, and even with her journalism, as you said, she would write under the vernacular, which must have annoyed the editor, I was thinking, knowing editors, because at the time there were no, what they call byline, who wrote the story, like Sue, you would have a byline. But if you're a celebrity like A.B. Patterson, who wrote about going to the New Hebrides and, they were sending over settlers to New Caledonia. and he wrote these fascinating kind of articles about that. So it would be a special series by A.B. Patterson, or war reporting by A.B. Patterson. So they knew the value of a name, and bulletin particularly as well. But she wrote even then under the vernacular, which would have been annoying to the editor because her name was such a draw card. And then she went on and did pseudonyms, like you said. She did, with a book that came out in 1909, she did write that under Miles Franklin, but then she didn't use it again until much later.
And Miles was good because nobody knew whether she was a girl or a boy,
yeah,
really.
It's androgynous.
No.
Which is what she wanted. So
It must have been really hard for her because she didn't really have the support of her family, and her uncle kept saying that he thought he was one of the characters in My Brilliant Career, the bad character. So he demanded she never write another book again, and so...
Don't you write another book?
Yeah, so
it's
it was
all
very hard.
malicious lies, you know, and I think that put her off kids as well, like governessing. I was like, after like if you've seen I watched, Blanche and I watched the film recently again. I'd watched it after writing the book, which I'm glad I did because I was so excited to see all the scenes and that atmosphere that, you know, Gillian Armstrong and Margaret Fink, the producer, had like constructed so well. And then you know, and I was like, oh God, I was going for that in the book. I really wanted to get that sense of atmosphere. But then we watched it again, and I was thinking about those mixed SWAT kids. You know, she goes and she's forced to governess for her cousins to pay off a family debt, and they're all a bit feral. And I'm just like, yeah.
Any more questions? I know you said you'd really like to read a quote from Miles from the back of the book.
In the back of the book, yeah. So it's easy to find. I won't get lost. So I really feel this actually sums up Miles. So, and you know, the book, it's like the real life sequel to My Brilliant Career. But she says, there is a theory that any woman can be rescued from the shoals of failure and despair by finding some man to ask her in marriage. But before I could be happy in love, I should at least need to realise myself. So I do think that. I think to realise yourself is that was what she wanted to do, and that was through writing. And I think, yes, marriage is a choice.
And now you've finished the book and it's out and we're all going to go and buy it in a second. Do you kind of miss her? I know you said you still have conversations with her.
Yeah, I've been talking to her, which... I was telling her last night we're going to Wagstaffe today and we're going to have a crowd hopefully, and I think that she would be enjoying the attention. Sydney Writers Festival, I'm doing that. I think she'd be enjoying it. Sometimes I feel very like a sense of responsibility to her writing as well. Like I hope that she likes what I've done with it. Like I think ideally, you know, I hope at least some of it's been published. I initially did look at, like I said, publishing just the servant work as an edited academic text. Someone might do that later on.
Sure.
I think it's really hard. A publisher is like, no. Yeah. Even Miles Franklin, it's such an amazing story. Yeah, no, it's not going to work.
No.
And that's, you know, so maybe someone will come along and find a way, or it will get published by itself as an academic text. When I say academic, I mean with an introduction and an edited text. So I'd be happy to work with like an editor on that if that's as a companion piece. But yeah, it's like over 100,000 words,
and it's great. You've brought us a contemporary version, really. You've kind of made it much more compelling and enthralling for us, really. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So. Yeah, and tried to pull out the characters and the themes of it, and tried to use, so any time it's quoted, that is from the actual manuscript. You know, so I tried to use her words.
Fantastic. So, no, that's great.
So
and I think
she likes it.
Sorry, I just cut you off.
Like it.
Oh, good. Oh, we can feel her presence here. Thanks, Miles. And thank you so much, Kerrie. I want to say thanks for sharing everything with us. It's been a fantastic journey, really. It's been a long journey as well for you.
Yeah, it's been about 5 years. I'm always astonished when I see on Insta or you know, X threads, you know, all the socials. Oh, I'm on my second book this year, and I'm like,
how did that happen? Yeah.
How did that happen? You know.
No, well, thank you very much, and we look forward to reading this one for anyone who hasn't read it yet, and look forward to the next one. So thank you very much.